Welcome back to Romans. I'm so glad you've joined us again for another round of lecture. I'd like to open with a thought from Peter in 2 Peter 3:16, and he says something there that really should come as a relief to all of us. He says that there are some things in Paul's letters that are hard to understand. Now, folks, if he felt that way, don't be surprised if you feel that way as well. And one of those challenging topics in Paul's writings in the book of Romans is his discussion of Jews and Gentiles. So far in the course and in our lectures, we've laid a foundation of key themes found in Romans, including the gospel, righteousness, grace, and justification. And this foundation is absolutely necessary for us to understand Paul's discourses about Jews and Gentiles in Romans. He already established that we all are justified freely by grace, both Jew and Gentile. He emphasizes grace over the law. If the law could have saved us, Jesus wouldn't have needed to come. But the law couldn't because we couldn't fulfill the law. And so he explains all of this, explains the grace of God and how that's demonstrated in our lives. And then just when it seems like Paul is about to give up on the Jews in favor of the Gentiles, Paul circles back with some bold pronouncements about the grace of God and the covenant of God that extends to the Jews. Paul talks at great length about how the Jews could not come to God through their works, despite their best efforts to do so. I already said that if we could come to God through the law, through fulfilling the law, then we wouldn't need Jesus Christ. And so God's extension of grace through the gospel of Jesus Christ, that opened the door wide for the Gentiles. It would remain open wide for the Jews as well, reminding them of the covenant God made with them and the grace he extended to them. It would remain not because of their works, but because of grace. Now, before we dive into what Paul says, I'd like to give a background, really, of kind of the lay of the land, of what's going on at the time that Paul is writing. And so it's really helpful for us to understand that in Rome, the earliest house churches would have been primarily Jewish. There would have been some Gentile Christians who were allowed to be part, but when you came to these house churches, culturally it felt Jewish. It probably didn't feel that different from what they experienced when they gathered together before Christianity. But in AD 49, something happened that really changed the landscape in Rome in a drastic way. The Roman Emperor Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. This included the Jewish Christians as well. If you were in any way an ethnic Jew, you were kicked out of Rome. And so that was in AD 49. And by the time that Paul wrote Romans, somewhere around AD 57, that emperor Claudius would have died by then. And the Jews would have started trickling back into Rome. But make no mistake, the landscape of the Christian church in Rome had drastically shifted by that time. And not only did the makeup of the church shift, but how Jews and Christians were viewed also drastically changed. So before all of this, Christianity was considered a subset or a sect of Judaism. It was like Judaism is this overarching religion that had been around for thousands of years. But this little subset, this little group of Christians came on the scene, and now they were gaining momentum, but they were still seen largely as a Jewish group. But after all of the Jews were expelled from Rome and the Gentiles took the lead, what we began to see is that those Jewish cultural underpinnings were now gone. And Jews and Christians began to be viewed as separate groups. One unexpected result of these demographic shifts is the unity of Christianity in Rome. So prior to Claudius's edict, Christian house churches, I already said they felt like Jewish communities, but when But when the Jewish Christians returned back to Rome, after their expulsion was ended, they discovered a Christianity that really felt foreign to them because of the cultural changes. So think about this. Think about, you've been part of this group. You've been, so to speak, a power broker. You've been in that founding group. I kind of liken it with our family. Okay, we founded the church. We founded our church where we are privileged to serve. It's the Sanctuary Church. Founded it in our living room. So, if we'd been part of everything, then we'd go away for a while, not because we chose to, but we're forced to go away for a while. And then another cultural group comes and the church goes in a different direction. And that's sort of within the subset, right, of our own context. But think about it when you have vastly different religious groups, because now the Gentiles who were brought in, who were coming to faith, they were the ones who were sort of setting the terms of the faith for them. So you can understand why that really felt so different for those Jewish believers coming back to Rome. And I started by saying that one maybe surprising result of these demographic shifts was the unity of Christianity in Rome. But many times we'll find that unity doesn't just happen. And many times we think that unity is just the present of the absence of any sort of disagreements, right? But unity is really something that we contend for. We contend for unity. We contend to fight for unity when we don't have the same views, right? Just the absence of conflict doesn't necessarily mean unity. It just maybe means that there isn't anything there isn't a diverse background, or there isn't anything that could create conflict. But now we see tensions rose over who was in charge and how they would relate to Jewish culture. So would they primarily be a Jewish group so that as people came in, they would have to adopt those Jewish cultural preferences, even though all that was already settled in the book of Acts, but it didn't really trickle down that way, right? And so what we're finding here is tension arose over how will we keep unity. And in a drastic twist, Jews were the ones who had to assimilate and find ways to fit in. When just a generation before, many of these Jews were asking, can Gentiles even be saved? Now they're coming into a Gentile Christian church, and they're finding their ways, and they're truly having to work out their unity together. And so what we see, and we see a lot of this that Paul is addressing, there is a struggle from the self-identification of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, right? There was kind of like in the beginning, okay, we're Jews who have become Christians, and then if you're coming to us, we're Gentiles, but there are these two separate groups. And what we find is that the Apostle Paul, he goes to great pain with a lengthy emphasis on how their lineage simply just didn't matter. And so he does that in a way to help them see the need for their unity, and that, hey folks, no longer are there Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians. It's just we're Christians, and we're in this together, and we're coming together for the greater good to spread the mission and the vision of Jesus Christ. So I hope that background will help us to connect some dots to a degree. And then I'd like for us to dive right into one of the more confusing statements by Paul in the book of Romans. And so in Romans 11, verse 26, he declares that all Israel will be saved. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. That's a pretty bold declaration that all of Israel will be saved. And if we use a key principle of hermeneutics to allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, that means we don't just pull various verses out of context and just say, oh, wow, this is something that was said, and then try to make a proof text out of it. No, we read Scripture in context. We read what was written before. We read what's immediately around it, and then we read what was written after so that we can properly understand. And so if we do that, then we keep reading down. We read Romans 11:26, we read Romans 11:27, where Paul quotes from Isaiah 59. He says, "And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Now, Paul explains right there that he is referring to the covenant of salvation because he's talking about taking away their sins, the Messiah coming to take away their sins. And now here's where it gets interesting, and where hopefully the background I provided will help us to make sense of this. Because even the language that we use, Jews and Gentiles, even that is pretty telling. You see, the Jews are the promised descendants of Abraham. They are God's chosen people. And the Gentiles are simply, well, they're just everyone else. The Gentiles are anyone who isn't a Jew. And so, for Paul's purposes in this passage, there are two categories of Jews. There are ethnic Jews, and then there are Jewish Christians, okay? So right here we can see the categories. There's Jew versus Gentile. And then within that category of Jews, there are two types of Jews. There are the ethnic Jews who have not become followers of Jesus Christ, and then there are the Jewish Christian believers. Now, since Jewish Christians have already received salvation through Jesus Christ, that simply can't be the group of Jews that Paul is talking about, because he's talking about something that is coming. And these Jewish believers, they've already received salvation. So that's not who he's talking about, okay? But if we look back to the story of God relating to his covenant people, to the Jews, we can see that God's chosen people had a pretty long track record of living for him, then walking away, and back and forth and back and forth. But God's covenant promise to them was much greater than Israel's disobedience. And we see that throughout his interactions with them. And Paul wants us to know that that continues to remain, that God has not given up on them. And so Paul tells his readers that Israel will find salvation once again. He uses the olive tree, again, just before verse 26, he uses this illustration of the olive tree to show Israel's preeminence in the plan of God and how Gentiles are connected. They're connected to the plan of God, but the tree starts with the Jews, so God will not forget them. Now, that's a great story, and it's really not all that unbelievable for those who have read the Old Testament, right? So if you've read the Old Testament, you understand God's special relationship and maybe even some of those messianic prophecies, and maybe you can even see how God opened the door for Gentiles to come to him. There were Gentile converts in the Old Testament, so it's not like that Gentiles never came to God before Jesus. It's just that through Jesus, he fulfilled the law. So there was no more distinction to be tied to so many of those Jewish cultural practices and so many of the specifics of the law, but the door opened wide for the Gentiles. So that's not that hard for us to believe or for us to understand. But what makes it hard in this passage is this one tiny little word that Paul uses, and that word is all. So what does all mean when Paul uses this? Does it mean every single Jewish person in the world, as in they don't have a choice, and because they are ethnic Jews, every single one of them will become Christians? Or does it mean some sort of representation or some sort of percentage or some sort of group of them who will be saved? If you continue reading the analogy used of the olive tree, Paul describes an irony that you probably didn't see coming. He talks about how, of course, we know that the Gentiles, they come to God, and there's that connection through the Jews. But the thing that's really interesting, that's really ironic, is how Paul describes that God would use the Gentiles to save Israel. That through God's love to the Gentiles, the Jews would become jealous for what the Gentiles had in God, and they would be saved. I mean, that's crazy to think about. The people to whom everything was given, that just this exclusive relationship, now they're going to be wooed back to God by seeing what God does for the Gentiles. Paul also talks about branches being broken off. Okay, so he's talking about parts of that Jewish lineage being broken off and the Gentiles being grafted in. And so you see this relationship, this connection that is so strong, that's so powerful. But he really reveals so much in verse 25. He states that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And this shows the reader that when he's talking about salvation coming to the Jews, he's most likely referring to the time when the church age ends, okay? So for now, there will be Jewish believers. That's why he said a partial hardening. Some of the Jews, their hearts were never hardened. They immediately received the word. They became followers of this Messiah that had been promised. They became Jewish Christians. But what we will find in the end of the church age is that God will turn again en masse to the ethnic Jews who have been far from him. So if you look at this passage from an eschatological perspective, that is speaking of things to come, then it makes sense that this passage is referring to a time when all of Israel will once again be the focus of God's outreach, and they will turn to him. Not just the ethnic Jews who became Christian believers during this time, because their hearts have been opened. They're already saved. But those who have hardened their hearts to the message, or the hardened majority that is referred to here, at this time, the Spirit of God, the grace of God, the covenant that God made with them, his Spirit will be so strong and it will come back to them. And so at this time, when this happens, there will no longer be two categories of Jews, because God's covenant with them will stir their hearts toward him. And so from that perspective, it's easier to see all to mean God's outreach to ethnic Jews. He's calling them back to him, and that they all would have the opportunity for salvation. God will pour out his Spirit on ethnic Israel as promised according to their specific covenant with him, and they will accept the Messiah en masse. And Keener speaks to it in such a way. He describes it as corporate deliverance and covenant renewal. So that means it may not mean that every single Jew will be saved, but it does mean that every one of them will have that opportunity, because it is God refocusing his attention, his efforts, his evangelistic outreach, so to speak, back on the hardened majority of the Jews, those ethnic Jews. And so that beloved story should inspire you. It should inspire each one of us, because it demonstrates just how committed God is to keeping his promises to his people. And thank God that we have been grafted in to become his own. Thank you for joining me this week. God bless you.